We are continuing our stories in the book of Daniel. We're on chapter 5 today. And take your Bibles to chapter 5. We're going to look at chapter 5 verses 1 through 31. And we're not going to look at all those verses, but we're going to talk about all those verses because this is an important part of the story, the narrative again. In last chapter, we looked at chapter 4 with Nebuchadnezzar. He was for 7 seasons or 7 times he was without the kingdom. Then he was restored by God. But in chapter 5, though, we have his grandson, Belshazzar, who was the king of Babylon at this time. And he was not the kind of wise king that his grandfather was. And as he learned to humble himself before God, this one, and I think the picture really doesn't do it justice. He was actually probably younger than what the picture represents. He was not a wise king at all in years. And to begin our introduction, though, most Christians know how to respond when the world criticizes us. But also, how do we do it when we are promoted, when we are actually in some ways the world starts to admire us and to think popular of us, thinking in good ways about us? Sometimes the greatest danger isn't persecution, it's promotion. In chapter 6, we're going back to the idea of persecution about people who are of faith. But the world has a way of trying to reward God's people while refusing to honor God himself. And Daniel shows us that. Daniel faced that very situation. King Belshazzar had ignored God all his entire life. But when troubles come, he goes to Daniel. He sees Daniel as being absolutely indispensable because of that. The same world that ignored God's servant now wanted to honor him. And the question comes, and this is really for us, if we apply this to the 21st century today of Christianity, how should faithful people of God today respond when unbelievers want to reward us or suddenly want to honor us in some ways? Well, Daniel shows us. And that's exactly what we're looking at today in Daniel chapter 5. Take your Bible and turn over there at this time. I want to begin by saying, in our first point, the faithless often seek God's people only in their crisis, only the time when they need us. Oftentimes we're ignored until that time. And so that's what we see in this part. Let's read verses 1 through 12, if you will, and give us the setting of how this all takes place. Belshazzar the king made a great feast for 1,000 of his lords and drank wine in the presence of the 1,000. While he tasted the wine, Belshazzar gave the command to bring the gold and silver vessels which his father Nebuchadnezzar, actually his grandfather, had taken from the temple which had been in Jerusalem, that the king and his lords, his wives, his concubines might drink from them. Then they brought the gold vessels that they had been taken from the temple of the house of God, which had been in Jerusalem, and the king and his lords, his wives and his concubines drank from them. They drank wine and praised the gods of gold and silver and bronze and iron, wood and stone. Now, what he was doing was, kind of give you the setting. The Persian army was right outside. And here they're just trying to rally the troops. They thought, well, they're not going to get in. We're impenetrable. This was actually a matter of pride doing all this. It was actually just a toast. We're safe. It's kind of just to calm themselves because of the great danger that was right outside. But it goes on to say, in verse 5, the Bible tells us, in the same hour the fingers of a man's hand appeared and wrote opposite the lampstand on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace. And the king saw the part of the hand that wrote. Then the king's countenance changed, and his thoughts troubled him, so that the joints of his hips were loosed, and his knees knocked against each other. The king cried aloud to bring the astrologers, the Chaldeans, the soothsayers. The king spoke, saying to the wise men of Babylon, whoever reads this writing and tells me its interpretation shall be clothed with purple and have a chain of gold around his neck, and he shall be the third ruler in the kingdom. Now, although king's wise men came, they could not read the writing or make known the king its interpretation. Then King Belshazzar was greatly troubled, his countenance was changed, and his lords were astonished. The queen, because of the words of the king and his lords, came to the banquet hall. The queen spoke, saying, O king, live forever. Do not let your thoughts trouble you, nor let your countenance change. There is a man in your kingdom in whom the Spirit of the Holy God, and in the days of your father, light and understanding and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, were found in him. The king Nebuchadnezzar, your father, the king, made him chief of the magicians, astrologers, Chaldeans, and soothsayers, inasmuch an excellent spirit, knowledge, understanding, interpreting dreams, solving riddles, and explaining enigmas, were found in this Daniel, whom the king named Belteshazzar. Now let Daniel be called, and he will give the interpretation. And from this we find that Belshazzar felt so confident despite the danger outside the walls. The Persian army had surrounded the city. Instead of humbling himself, what does he do? He goes and gets the gold vessels, and he actually mocks God by drinking and praising the gods of the false gods of wine and such. But then suddenly, as we see from this reading, it was fear. His fear replaced his pride. His confidence completely melted away and disappeared. His color changed, and his knees knocked together. You can just imagine that, how frightening that must have been. You know, you watch these kind of scary movies of today, we get shocked by all the things of that, and that's really not what we're talking about here. We're talking about something real, simply a handwriting on the wall. And it's like it's something that would be so upsetting because it suddenly appeared at this time. And the king, we see, calls all his men, his astrologers, his wise men, his magicians, but none could help. Only then someone remembered the queen. And it's actually, as if we understand the lineage of this, as I was researching this, she was probably the older, his mother or grandmother, possibly. She actually remembered Daniel when he was there. And so she is pointing to Daniel as the one that could help in this situation. So that's what we find here. He's called to help, to interpret all that was on the wall there. Once again, you might say, the faithful were called as a last resort. We saw that as a repeating pattern all through the book of Daniel. Chapter 2, chapter 4 as well. There's times when people of the faithless, they need to call upon people of faith to help them, to know things. And yet this we see, that's exactly what Daniel was, as he was someone who can interpret the dreams and be able to show them what was needed, what was the warning there. It's actually not good news, as we know that is exactly the problem there. And one lesson we learn from this is that the faithful cannot be taught, cannot be bought. In verses 13 to 17, we find here that when Belshazzar gets him in there, he says, "Are you the Daniel is the one who, the captives of Judah, whom my father the king brought from Judah? I have heard of you, and the Spirit of God is in you, and that light and understanding and excellent wisdom are found." And he talks about all the astrologers, how they failed. And then in verse 16, "And I have heard of you that you can give interpretation, explain enigmas. Now if you could read the writing and make known to me its interpretation, you shall be clothed with purple and have a chain of gold around your neck, and shall be the third ruler in the kingdom." Now verse 16 tells us here's the reward if you can do this, Daniel. And so here is what the proposition. You give me the meaning of this and I'll promote you. In verse 17, the Bible tells us, "Then Daniel answered and said before the king, let your gifts be for yourself, and give rewards to another. Yet I will read the writing to the king and make known to him the interpretation." In other words, I can't be bought. I'm not going to do this to change the message or to give it a more favorable spin just because of the rewards. And that's exactly what Daniel did. He stood firm again to compromise. You might say some who would be tempted to compromise the message because of the reward. But you know what Daniel was actually looking for? The real reward was from God. not from just men. Daniel refused the reward of the wicked or the faithless in this regard. And so you see that happens, people of faith. And this is one of the great stories of the book of Daniel. The whole theme is about faithfulness. All 6 chapters, it's written on every page about people of God who stood firm and faithful. We're not like men like Gehazi. If you look at the 2 men, I chose this as a comparison. There was 2 men, there was 2 choices, and there was 2 different legacies, 2 different outcomes, if you will. One said no to the reward. The other says, I'm going to run after it. You know, he refused what was never his. That's what Daniel did. And he honored God above all. He realized what God could give him far outshined what men could do. That promotion to third ruler, the chain of gold and the purple robe, didn't mean anything to Daniel. And Gehazi, though, the Bible tells us here that he was different than that. He actually went for the reward. If you look at what the Bible says about Gehazi, that once he realized that Elisha had turned down this money or whatever reward, he said, I will go after him and run and pursue him and catch up with him. And that one he would get the reward. But that's the problem with Gehazi. He was more interested in what? The earthly prize than what God could give him. He was a servant of Elisha, but yet he chose to do what was wrong. And he was coveted. That's the problem. When we see those kind of rewards and things like that, you know, you might think, well, he didn't get to enjoy that because the leprosy of Naaman went to him. And so that's what happened with Gehazi. If we look at 2 Kings chapter 5, that's the problem of when we go after rewards, earthly rewards rather than heavenly rewards. And point number 3, faithfulness speaks the whole truth. Again, we learned that in our last lesson, chapter 4, about speaking all the truth. Well, again, there is a compromise, or there's a temptation to compromise, to not really give all of it. But you know what Daniel did? Daniel could have just translated the words and just gave him the meaning. But he actually gave him a sermon before that. He preached to him about God's blessing. Let's read the passage here. In verse 18, here it says, O King, the Most High God gave Nebuchadnezzar, your father, a kingdom and majesty, glory, and honor. And because of the majesty that he gave him, all peoples, nations, and language trembled and feared before him. Whomever he wished, he executed. Whomever he wished, he kept alive. Whomever he wished, he set up. And whoever he wished, he put down. But when his heart was lifted up, and his spirit was hardened in pride, he was deposed from his kingly throne, and they took his glory from him. Then he was driven from the sons of men. His heart was made like the beast, and his dwelling was with the wild donkeys. They fed him with grass like oxen, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven, till he knew that the Most High God rules in the kingdom of men and appoints over it whomever he chooses. And I'll stop there. This is all, you might say, before he even gets to the interpretation. He's telling him the past and showing him how that when Daniel was with his grandfather or father, if you look at it that way, that was what happened in the kingdom. That God had humbled him and shown him that your kingdom, as great as it is not as great as God's kingdom. And his rule is over the sons of men. That's really what was shown to this. You know, one of the saddest statements is actually found in verse 22. If you look at it, verse 22 where we stopped at says, But you, his son Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, although you knew all this. He knew all this. And yet he chose to do what he did anyway. And that's really the saddest part about the whole story of chapter 5, is that he defied God even when his father had humbled himself. He had not done as wickedly as Belshazzar had done. Nebuchadnezzar knew, but yet Belshazzar forgot that, willingly forgot that. Then came the interpretation. And here it talks about in verse 23, Again, more about this says, and you have lifted up yourself against the Lord of heaven. They have brought the vessels of his house before you, and you and your lords, your wives, and your concubines have drunk wine from them. And you praise the gods of silver and gold, bronze and iron, wood and stone. And he's basically saying, you thumbed your nose to God. You were defying God. Verse 24, then the fingers of the hands were sent from him, and his writing was written. And this is an inscription that was written. And he gives that inscription, just like on the chart there. This is the interpretation, verse 26, of each word. Mene, which God has numbered your kingdom and finished it. Tekel, you have been weighed in the balances and found wanting. And Perez, your kingdom has been divided and given to the Medes and Persians. That was the judgment. It was not just warning, that was judgment against what was going to happen that very night. You see, this was the last day that Belshazzar was going to live here on planet Earth. As we know, the invading army was right outside, and they found a way inside of the palace of Babylon that day, that very night. And so again, they didn't listen to all the instruction that Nebuchadnezzar had learned from Daniel in the first place. And so that's the problem. They should have listened to what God had said. And the lesson we can learn from this, we need to learn the lessons from the past as well, so we don't repeat the mistakes and the sins that many make when it comes to living ways that are not godly, not listening to God. You know, not listening to God and his ways is the worst mistake we could ever make in our lives. And point number 4, the faithful accept honor without being controlled by it. Now you may think that, well, he turned down this honor, but you know, Belshazzar gave it to him anyway. As we understand verse 29 to 31, then Belshazzar gave the command, and they clothed Daniel with purple and put a chain of gold around his neck and made a proclamation concerning him, that he should be the third ruler in the kingdom. That very night, king of the Chaldeans was slain, and Darius the Mede received the kingdom. No relation to me and my family though, but Darius the Mede received the kingdom being about 62 years old. That's you might say, the end result. How long, you might say, did Daniel get to keep that position as third ruler? And I think in some ways Daniel may have realized what was said there. God would give, this was a judgment against him, that it wasn't going to matter if he gave him the whole kingdom. It wasn't going to last. And that's really the problem here. We'll talk about that in the next point. But the question I want to pose, is it wrong to accept rewards from the faithless? That's really some of the things we see from this particular passage. There's times when faithful men of God have turned down things, like Abraham did. When reward was trying to be given to him, he said, no, I'm not going to take anything for this. Daniel accepted the honor after giving the message first. You know, that's the difference, isn't it? Is when we look at the reward, so, you know, I'll do it. And we conspire for the reward. No, that's not what Daniel did. Daniel gave the interpretation first, then the reward came. He wasn't motivated. He made it very clear, I'm not going to be motivated by the reward. And the application for us is, can Christians receive honor from the world? Well, if you can look back at some of the others, you might say, in the past, like Joseph, and he's also an interpreter of dreams. You know, Pharaoh promoted him to the second in command, you might say, of the kingdom. The Bible tells us here in that reading of Genesis 41, then Pharaoh took his signet ring off his hand and put it on Joseph's hand, and he clothed him in his garments of fine, or clothed him in garments of fine linen, and put a gold chain around his neck. Very similar to what Daniel wore just for a little while. And he had him to ride in the second chariot which he had had, and they cried out before him, bow the knee. So he set him over all the land of Egypt. In Esther chapter 6, Mordecai was very similarly rewarded. When Haman answered to the king, well, what will What reward should the king give to the man who the king wants to delight in? Well, Haman thought it was him. He said this, "For the man whom the king delights to honor, let a royal robe be brought which the king has worn, and a horse on which the king has ridden, which has a royal crest placed on his head." In other words, you put a crown on him, you let him ride, you wear the king's robes, all that. And Esther also was one. And that, go back to chapter 2, verse 18. The king made a great feast, the feast of Esther, even named it after her, for all his officials and servants. And he proclaimed a holiday in the provinces and gave gifts according to the generosity of a king. Now I will tell you, the only time it's wrong is when there is an implication, or you might say a direct way of trying to get us to change our message. If we change our message because of rewards, when the world, the faithless, try to honor us, then we have truly compromised. But that's not what Daniel did. Daniel teaches us that we can do that without compromise, without going the way that others have gone. Not that it really means anything to us. Again, because our last point, it really shows us that, doesn't it? That worldly honors never last. Now I think in the picture you can see how that very night they were conquered by the Medes and Persians and all that. The Bible tells us here that Daniel, even though he was made third ruler, this still wasn't going to last. We read verses 29 to 31 already. But the question comes, how long was Daniel the third ruler? Just for an evening, wasn't it? For the very evening and the very night, you might say. And that's the way worldly honors really are. If you think about it, worldly honors, the crowns, the riches that men might bestow upon us, they never last. That's why we have to look to the eternal reward. That's why Moses, he looked to what God could recompense rather than what all the treasures of Egypt. In 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 25, Paul says something interesting here about everyone who competes for the prize is temperate in all things. He's talking about a race. You know how they have races like the Olympics, and we still have those kind of things today, don't we? Where people compete for the prize, and they're doing all these things, practicing for years. They are so disciplined. They watch their weight, and they do all this because why? They're after the prize. Their eye is on the prize. Now, Paul says, now they do it to obtain a perishable crown, but we for an imperishable crown. Now, the implication is that they put so much effort, so much time, so much of their ability goes into trying to increase their ability so they can do the best and win the prize, be the fastest runner. All for a wreath that would last only just a little while. People forget that you won the race after a few years. Why? Because that's the way it is with temporary kind of rewards. They never last. What does last is the eternal reward that God has for us. When we look at the Bible, we look at what God has for us. He has something so much better than what the world can offer for us today. We might look, well, here I can have this here and now. And that's really the appeal, is to have things here and now, and I don't have to wait. But if we'll simply wait for what God has, it's infinitely better than what man has to offer us. Thank you very much for your kind attention to the lesson. That will now prepare for our Bible studies.